event attribution. My guess is you ask 100 people in this country what they think that means, they wouldn't have a clue. And until a couple of weeks ago, some of us would not have either. But when we leave here today, hopefully we'll know it and not just understand it ourselves, but actually be able to explain it to others. But I'm told that this may be the first ever congressional hearing on the topic of extreme event attribution. And to understand why we're holding today's hearing, I think it might be helpful to ask and answer a few questions. First, what is extreme event attribution anyway? And besides being quite a mouthful, extreme event attribution looks at how a specific extreme weather event, such as a particular heat wave or a flood, was made worse by climate change. And second, why is this kind of climate science important, real important? And to answer that question, we need to first acknowledge the fact that human-caused climate change is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events. Earlier this year, the American Meteorological Society issued a report by many of our nation's leading climate scientists and meteorologists. That report detailed, as I'm sure our witnesses know, how climate change has driven unprecedented heat waves, floods, and droughts this year and in recent years. And we know that continues to be the case. And when Phoenix, Arizona experiences an unprecedented 31 days of temperatures at or above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, as they did this summer, or when historic rainfall leads to severe flooding in places like Florida and Vermont, as it did this year. And many of us find ourselves asking, is climate change to blame for this? And the honest answer is yes, yes it is. Now, it's true that we have always had heat waves, or at least for as long as I've been around, 76 years. And, but it's also true that climate change is making them more intense. So the better question, I think, is to ask ourselves the question is, how much worse did climate change make this heat wave, or how much worse did it make that flood? That's the kind of question that extreme event attribution scientists, including at least one of our witnesses today, Dr. Wehner, work to answer. These questions matter because the human harms and costs of climate change are massive, and sadly, they are growing. As many of our colleagues know, I represent the lowest lying state in our nation, Delaware. And in Delaware, we're already losing our dunes, we're losing our wetlands to sea level rise and to nor'easters. And as we work to repair our homes and businesses and infrastructure, replenish our beaches are damaged by these events, we are already paying for the cost of climate change. But this is not a hearing just about the Delaware, it's about a hearing about the 49 other states and a planet that we all share, and with people around the world. We're grappling with the costs of climate change. Today, we're going to focus on how it's fueling extreme weather, and maybe even more important, what can we do about it? Now, in one sense, the climate change is already affecting every aspect of our weather. Overall, NASA tells us that global temperatures have increased a little more than 1 degree Celsius. That's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. That is due mostly to human-caused climate change. Because our planet is warmer, on average, the hot days are becoming hotter. And because a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, rainstorms are growing more intense. Warmer oceans are also producing stronger hurricanes. And last week, we saw Hurricane Otis wreak havoc, wreak devastation in Mexico, where it rapidly intensified from a Category 1 storm to a Category 5 in less than 10 hours. Think about that, less than 10 hours. I couldn't believe it, but it's true. Let me close and turn it over to Senator Capito, but first let me say you and I don't experience planetary averages. We live through and we clean up from and we pay for specific weather disasters. Extreme weather, extreme event attribution science help us to explain these events. So recognizing that we, as a planet, must prepare for more frequent and intense weather in the future. And as elected leaders, we also need to understand what to expect in our states and our communities. How much worse will our heat waves become in the years to come? How likely is it that a community will experience an even larger flood next time? Extreme event attribution science is helping us answer those questions as well. The ability to do so will be critical as we plan future infrastructure projects that we do. We work a lot on that stuff and kind of stuff here in this committee. Where we wrote big parts of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. This lady right here and I. And then we had the privilege of managing it on the floor, one of the biggest infrastructure bills in the history of the country. But making more informed policy decisions will help us protect more Americans from extreme weather and allow us to use taxpayer dollars more effectively. Let me close by reminding everyone that while climate change is driving the weather, extreme weather, we are not helpless and we are not hopeless. The situation is not hopeless. Working together, we can prevent the worst impacts of global warming by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what we're doing. And thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure bill that I've just mentioned and the Inflation Reduction Act, we're beginning to turn this adversity into opportunity. And importantly, we're doing so in a way that invests in American-made clean energy, lowers energy costs, creates good-paying jobs all over the country, and makes communities all over the country more resilient. Still, it's important to acknowledge that we have a lot more work to do ahead of us to tackle this challenge. So as we take those steps to better prepare for extreme weather and manage its impacts, extreme event attribution can be an important tool. And with that, we look forward to hearing from witnesses today about how communities can better understand and anticipate what is coming and increase their resilience to climate-fueled extreme weather. Before we do that, though, I want to hear from, and I know we all want to hear from a ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening statement. Senator Capito, welcome. You are recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. And before I begin, I have a throat lozenger in my mouth, so if I sound weird or if I start choking, I might need you to help me out. So I apologize for that.
I can see the headline.
It's
Carper
preventing me
saves
from
Capito
coughing.
from throat lozenges. And her hearing in her life.
An extreme throat event. Anyway, I want to thank and talk about our committee's strong bipartisan work to reduce emissions and make our infrastructure more resilient. Chairman talked about that. Legislation such as the Use It Act, reducing barriers to the deployment of carbon capture, the AIM Act, directing a phase down of heat trapping HFCs, the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, supporting carbon-free nuclear energy, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that the Chairman talked about, with its investments in emission reductions and resiliency, all passed in a bipartisan way. As we continue to build on that record by passing the ADVANCE Act and the NDAA to help deploy advanced nuclear reactors and technologies, as well as to renew our efforts on passing a permitting bill that will allow us to unlock American innovation across all types of technologies and bring American manufacturing back home. Several provisions of the IIJA are especially relevant to today's topic. That law's reauthorization of our surface transportation programs included a climate title for the very first time, establishing formula programs to help states build more resilient infrastructure and reduce certain emissions. The law also included funding for hydrogen hubs, like the Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub, known as ARCH-2, that will benefit my state of West Virginia and our region. And the IIJA included $25 million to help EPA process Class 6 permits and $50 million to help states obtain primacy for permitting Class 6 wells, a necessary step towards broader deployment of carbon capture and storage. Despite the resources we provided in IIJA, the EPA has not granted Class 6 primacy to any state under this administration, nor has EPA granted an individual Class 6 permit to store carbon dioxide since the Obama administration, with 169 Class 6 wells now waiting to be permitted under the EPA. Commercial-scale deployment of carbon capture and storage, I think, is vital if we are to meet our energy reliability needs while also addressing emissions. The administration must quickly review and process Class 6 primacy applications from states, as well as individual permit applications for projects in states without primacy. As our bipartisan work continues, there's widespread agreement that the climate is changing and that greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to that change. But I'm not sure that's the focus of the hearing. I'm not sure that the focus of the hearing is on that scientific consensus. At the end of Obama administration, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration published a question and answer page about extreme event attribution. It remains on the agency's climate.gov website today. One question posed there is what can't extreme event attribution tell us? I'll enter the entirety of the answer into the hearing record, but the short answer is it can't tell us whether global warming caused a specific event. With global warming and extreme events, it is not a yes or no question. I want to be clear, this does not mean that climate change has no impact on the intensity of weather patterns. The trends are clear, and we need to be ready. And with technologies and adaptation strategies like those I've described, or policies area about which this committee has demonstrated our expertise. It is critical and crucial that we have effective solutions that reduce flood risk and coastal storm risk across the country. Since 2014, the committee has kept to a biannual schedule of passing bipartisan water resource legislation to advance these solutions. And I look forward to continuing this track record. We've already had several hearings with our next latest WRDA bill. By contrast, I think some regressive policy, regulatory policies or carbon taxes that pick winners and losers could inhibit our U.S. energy production disproportionately and harm our most vulnerable communities through lost opportunities and displaced jobs. Rising energy costs and weakening of our grid will leave these constituents without access to affordable electricity and other basic necessities. Recognizing this, the government should not put in place a one-size-fits-all regulatory mandate. Successful climate technologies of the future may not even exist today, so we need to make sure we provide the adequate conditions for the necessary innovation to take place. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic, and the chairman shared that optimism. American innovation will rise to the occasion. I'm interested in today's discussion of developing research, but I'll be more interested to hear from our panel on what we should do today to build on our committee's record of bipartisan solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Capito. Arch, is the name of your hydrogen hub Arch? It is. Arch 2?
It is, Arch 2.
That includes also Ohio and what, PA?
Northwest or Southwest PA, yes.
There you go. First time I ever heard of Arch, like Arch 1, was your father.
That's why I can remember the name.
Who was governor of West Virginia when my sister and I were little kids living in Raleigh County, West Virginia. And Arch 3 could be another member of your family.
Well, I have a grandson named Arch, so I have Arch 2.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, and she has a son who's off the record is running for governor of the state of West Virginia, which is a great job, great job. All right, that now we're going to turn to our panel of esteemed witnesses, and we're grateful to each of you for joining us today to discuss this important topic. And I think we're going to hear from our witnesses in this order. I think Dr. Michael Wehner, I think, is our lead-off hitter. I think you're our lead-off hitter. And our second witness will be Jennifer Jurado. Is it Jurado? Jurado. Yes. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Paul. Is it my schedule spelled as phonetically as Dabbar? Is that the way you? Okay, good. Well, good. Excellent. I don't like to mispronounce people's names. So. Let me just say a word or two about each of our witnesses. Dr. Michael Wehner, a senior scientist within the Applied Mathematics and Computational Research Division at the U.S. Department of Energy Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, whose research focuses on extreme weather and a changing climate. Dr. Wehner was a lead author for the 213 fifth and 2013 fifth and 2020 first sixth assessment report. That's a mouthful, of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. Who came up with that name? My God. And also lead author for the second, the third, the fourth, and the upcoming fifth U.S. National Climate Assessment. Our second witness is, again, Dr. Jennifer Jurado, Chief Resilience Officer and Deputy Department Director for Broward County, Florida. In this role, Dr. Jurado is responsible for leading climate resilience and environmental planning initiatives for Broward County. And then we're going to hear from, again, Dabbar, former Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. Mr. Dabbar is also a senior research scholar at Columbia University and serves as CEO of Bohr Quantum Technologies. Seems like somewhere now, reading your bios, I thought I came across someone who may have served in the Navy. Is that true? Yeah. Navy slits. Navy, okay, Naval Academy, good for you. I got waitlisted there. I had to go to Ohio State, but I turned out okay. So did you. All right. Well, with that in mind, we're going to hear from Dr. Wehner. So please proceed with your statement. Your entire statement will be made part of the record, and then we'll hear from our other witnesses, and then we'll ask some questions. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and distinguished members of the committee. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to testify at this important hearing on the science of extreme weather event attribution. As you said, my research focuses on the behavior of extreme weather events in a changing climate, and I must say that my remarks are my own and not intended to represent the positions of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, the University of California, or the United States Department of Energy. According to the U.S. National Climate Assessments and the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it is unequivocal that humans have heated the Earth's climate. The best estimate is that human activities, principally the use of oil, coal, and gas, is responsible for all of the observed global warming since 1900. Our understanding about the
Dr.
effect...
Wehner, yeah, you can slow down. You can slow down just a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Our understanding about...
We can only hear so fast.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, at least I can't only hear so fast.
Our understanding about the effects of this human-caused global warming on specific individual weather events has advanced considerably in the past 2 decades. For many types of weather events, scientists can identify and quantify the ways that the human interference in the climate system has influenced extreme weather. Obviously, as you said, we have always experienced extreme weather, heat waves, droughts, extreme storms, and the like. But extreme weather attribution science attempts to quantify the influence of climate change on these specific individual events by answering 2 related questions. First, has global warming affected the severity of an event of a particular frequency, say once in 100 years? And second, given the observed intensity of an event, has global warming affected how rare it is? And I detailed this a little bit more in my written testimony. Because we have only one planet Earth, to answer these questions, scientists must use both climate and statistical models to compare representations of weather events in the actual world that was to a world that might have been without climate change. Confidence is increased when multiple independent research teams use different approaches and arrive at similar conclusions consistent with observed trends. Confidence in quantitative attribution statements is very high about the human influence on heat waves, agricultural drought, and certain classes of severe storms, including hurricanes. Indeed, as the Earth warms, every heat wave that we now experience is hotter than it would have been without climate change, including those this past summer in the United States and throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Throughout the lower 48 states, I estimate that any heat wave we now experience is 2.5 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it would have been. All Americans faced increased health risks from these hotter heat waves, particularly the very young, the very old, and the very poor in our society. Extreme storms have been made wetter by climate change as well. For instance, of the more than 30 different hurricanes that have been studied in an attribution context, all the analyses reveal a significant human fingerprint on the total rainfall amounts. Recent advances in attribution science have gone beyond studying the human influence on the meteorology of extreme weather events to include the impacts of these events on real people. Take Hurricane Harvey and the record flooding it caused in the greater Houston area, for example. Global warming made the surface waters of the Gulf of Mexico about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, increasing the rainfall during Hurricane Harvey by about 20%. This increased the area flooded by about 14%, importantly leading to a 32% increase in the number of flooded homes in Harris County. I estimate that global warming is then responsible for about 1/3 of the $150 billion in damages estimated by NOAA during Hurricane Harvey. These damages were not equally distributed across socioeconomic groups. Half of these flooded homes were in low-income Hispanic neighborhoods. As about 1/3 of Harris County is characterized as low-income Hispanic, this disproportionate impact represents an environmental justice, in my opinion. we're finding similar injustice to the most vulnerable of our society in an analysis of flooding in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, from the remnants of Hurricane Ida. This recent extension of attribution science from weather to impacts could be informative in negotiations for the Loss and Damages Fund to aid nations particularly vulnerable to climate change. This fund was established but not financed at last year's meeting of the Conference of Parties, the COP27, part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and will certainly be one of the topics discussed later this month at the COP28 in Dubai. The human influence on extreme weather and its impacts on people is quite clear. I'm often asked, why do we do these attribution studies? I have three answers to this question. First, the public demand for information about how climate change affects them personally is very high. People want to know. Second, increasing the number and variety of individual extreme events studied increases our understanding of the extent of the human influence on them. And third, and perhaps most importantly, our quantitative understanding can aid decision makers in increasing the resilience of our society to a future hotter world. Extreme weather event attribution has shown us that dangerous climate change is already happening. How much more dangerous we let it become is up to us. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thanks very much for your testimony. You mentioned, I think, one planet Earth. I heard at one point in your testimony you said one planet Earth, which reminds me of something that, not a witness here, but a fellow who came from France a couple of years ago and spoke at a joint session of Congress, a guy named Macron, President Macron, and he said, he didn't say one planet Earth, but he did say no planet B. He said, there's no planet B. He said, we're only going to get one planet. This is it. We got to take care of it. So I was reminded of his comments when you said that. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Jurado. And Dr. Jurado, we've already talked a little bit about your background, but we're delighted that you're here. Please proceed. You can talk as fast as you'd like. But please, no, you may want to do that. You got your speed down just perfect. Pitch perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, thank you for your leadership in convening this hearing today. As you shared, I am the Chief Resilience Officer for Broward County, the 17th largest county in the U.S. and the second most populous in the state of Florida with nearly 2 million residents. While we are leaders in many ways in adapting to a changing climate, we remain at the forefront of significant impacts. South Florida is no stranger to extreme weather. To manage nearly 60 inches of rainfall we receive annually, we've made extensive investments in drainage, flood control, stormwater management systems. Even so, as we grapple with the impacts of climate change, the limitations of these investments are evident, and record-breaking events are becoming more damaging. Most recently, on April 12, 2023, a thunderstorm delivered an unprecedented 26 inches of rainfall in 12 hours, impacting much of our community. A 30-minute commute became a 3-hour navigation of floodwaters. Flooded vehicles were abandoned en masse. The Fort Lauderdale-Hollywood International Airport closed for 40 hours. Fuel distribution from Port Everglades was disrupted, affecting 12 counties and 5 international airports. Water levels reached 2 to 3 feet in several older neighborhoods, and the city of Fort Lauderdale remains without a city hall. And yet this event occurred outside the hurricane season, a 1-in-1,000-year rainfall event. Less than 3 years earlier, Tropical Storm Eta delivered 22 inches of rainfall in 3 days. The 6-week rainfall total was 4 times the historical average, and inland areas, some of which remained flooded for 2 weeks. In 2017, an 18-inch rainfall event closed Sawgrass Mills, the region's largest shopping center, for 3 days. The economic loss was $30 million. These 3 extreme events, all in the last 6 years, account for the highest annual rainfall totals in the last 30, exceeding 88 inches in 2020. Congress has helped to ensure South Florida remains dry during wet weather events. In 1948, Congress authorized the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project, the CNSF, and it was constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Today, it serves 11 million residents, but it's under substantial stress, especially due to intense rainfall events and sea level rise. Given these new extremes, we've advocated for a new look at the CNSF system and thank the committee for its authorization of the comprehensive study of this flood control project as part of the 22 WRDA. Without this study and future funding for improvements, our local efforts would not be as effective. Of course, extreme conditions are not limited to flooding. This year, Broward County experienced 37 days with a heat index over 105 degrees Fahrenheit compared to an average of 5 days per year historically. We know that extreme heat disproportionately impacts the underrepresented residents, outdoor workers, health-compromised individuals, our youth and elders, affecting finances, earnings, and physical health. To better prepare for extremes, Broward County has incorporated sea level rise and rainfall intensification in updated design standards for our drainage systems, seawalls, and building elevations. We are developing a countywide resilience plan to address both flood and heat risk with emphasis on green infrastructure, especially where heat islands and vulnerable communities intersect. Although I'm formally representing Broward County, I'd like to highlight the efforts of our Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, a collaboration amongst Broward, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Monroe counties to address shared climate challenges. Jointly, we are developing a priority climate action plan supported by the EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program under the Inflation Reduction Act, and expect to emphasize energy efficiency improvements in lower-income housing. We've also pursued grant proposals under NOAA's recent Coastal Resilience Challenge and strongly support additional funding along these lines. Additional federal collaborations and programs aiding our efforts include modeling and monitoring supported by the USGS, technical assistance of NOAA, the Corps, USGS, and providing future conditions guidance for planning, DOE grant support for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the IRA's direct pay tax credits aiding clean energy and energy efficient investments by local governments, FEMA's BRIC and hazard mitigation grant programs, and the totality of the Corps' resilience efforts in our region, including shoreline protection, Everglades restoration, the CNSF project, Back Bay, and navigation studies. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues facing our region. Continued leadership and support for transitions to clean energy alongside aggressive adaptation actions is critical to our economic and community vitality. We look forward to continued collaborations with our federal agency partners, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. You packed a lot in to 5 minutes. That's pretty impressive. I think I could learn from you. Finally, we're going to hear from Mr. Dabbar, and you're recognized as well. We're happy you're here. Thanks so much for joining us. Please proceed.
Chair Carper, Ranking Member Capito, I am honored to be before the Senate again for the first time before this committee to discuss climate impact, energy innovation, and policy. Over my career, I've been engaged in all the various aspects of energy, including liberating neutrons at a reactor and addressing solutions for the environment. In particular, as Undersecretary for Science at the Department of Energy. And other than Senator Kelly, I've likely traveled to more remote locations to collect climate data. I'm one of the few people who has been to both the geographic North and South Poles, both in government service, and in part both missions were around climate data gathering. As Undersecretary, we supported gathering data and computer simulation of the climate, including the work of Dr. Wehner, at many of the national labs I ran, including Lawrence Berkeley, as well as at Nettle and others, in support of research at universities and in everyone's state here at the committee. The world has been successful at reducing different types of emissions due to innovation. And I believe the right strategy for the world today is to continue discovery, innovation, and deployment of new options. America has been the dominant country at investing in discovery and the lead in deployment of new energy technologies. And America is a global leader in the pipeline of new prospects. I'm quite positive about these prospects due to the U.S. being the world's leader in public and private energy R&D, including the world's leading universities, national labs, the dominant winner in Nobel Prizes in the physical sciences, and the global leader in venture capital and startups. I reached this positive conclusion based on a lot of data, most of which we are deploying today was invented within the last generation, such as commercially effective lithium-ion battery chemistry, wind turbines, innovative drilling technologies, and PV solar. And as Undersecretary, I enjoyed the Nobel Prize reception in the Senate vestibule for winning the Nobel into lithium-ion chemistry. And the pipeline for future innovation is very strong. For example, Form Energy, which has recently opened a plant in West Virginia, has developed an iron air battery that literally rusts and derusts for its chemistry, that produces power for 25 times longer than lithium ion and is 80% cheaper. X Energy, an SMR fission company, is in the process of building the next generation nuclear all over the country. And Montana Technology has developed a MOF-based HVAC cooling technology that uses up to 75% less energy and emissions than current compressor systems, and no Freon. American innovation has and will continue to lead the way to solutions. One final innovation takeaway that we should consider is that regulators or elected officials mandating winning energy technologies is poor technology policy. The innovation ecosystem has a track record of inventing new options that were not predicted. For example, President Bush's famous 2001 energy assessment had a long list of predictions of winning energy technologies, and most of them were significantly wrong. Unpredicted innovations in drilling, solar, and batteries came along and remade the landscape, including for emissions. It is better policy for EPA and the states to allow for a technology-neutral, innovation-open strategies that allow for the competition of discovery. And we need balance in energy policy. We need to concurrently care about increasing energy availability, lowering energy costs, lowering emissions, and national security. And due to American innovation and a solid all-the-above bipartisan pro-supply policies over the last generation, we were able to deliver on all those concurrently. I have the confidence that we can do that again this generation. While we certainly need to understand the drivers of climate change, we should focus on solutions also. America is the global energy superpower. We went from the largest energy importer in the world to the largest energy exporter. We invented for us and the world a portfolio of technologies that are making an impact on emissions. And there is a pipeline of even better ones to come. Policy to allow the ingenuity of Americans to harness and allow deployment of their new ideas will be the solution.
Great, thanks. Thank you very, very much. Dr. Jurado, let me just start. Let's see. I'll start with Dr. Wehner. Your colleague to your right there, Dr. Jurado, has told us that Fort Lauderdale and surrounding communities in southeast Florida have experienced several devastating torrential rainfall events over the last couple of years, including, I think she may have mentioned 26 inches of rainfall over 12 hours last April. 26 inches over 12 hours. And my question, Dr. Wehner, for you would be, would you consider this torrential rainfall event unusual? Should we expect to see more extreme rainfall events as climate change worsens?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, indeed. We talked briefly prior to the hearing about this storm, and what she said to me about this astonishing amount of rainfall, and most of it falling in a very short period of time, is completely consistent with my previous work on extreme storms, showing that the rainfall increases at a rate greater than the humidity increases. Now, humidity increases at a certain rate determined that we know very, very rigorously from first principles, but rainfall seems to be supercharged from climate change. And so what I would interpret is that this storm has been made more violent and hence more efficient at increasing this increased available moisture. Right. And we would expect yet more of that throughout the country, not just in Florida, and actually throughout the world.
Yeah. How about heat waves? Would, absent climate change, would we be experiencing events such as the Pacific Northwest 2021 heat wave, or this past summer's heat wave in the U.S.?
It's interesting you would highlight the 2021 heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. I consider this one a teachable moment for climate scientists. If you had asked me before that event when it would be 120 degrees in Canada, I would have said not for a long time. But indeed,
would you have said when hell freezes over?
Pardon?
Would you have said when hell freezes over?
No, I would have said about 2060, but
All right, thank you.
but clearly,
I think that's when it's scheduled to freeze over.
well, yeah, I suppose. So that was a surprise to us, and this will be an event that is probably the most studied extreme weather event of all time. Currently, there are at least 20 different papers on an event that happened just over a year ago. I have 3 myself.
3 of the 20?
3 of those 20 are mine. And we're learning a lot. And it's kind of scary because it was scary beforehand. And clearly this event was unprecedented, caused a lot of people to die. How many more died because of climate change is not something I know. But I would say that it was at least 2 degrees warmer from climate change, possibly 4, not much more than that. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at the effect of high temperatures on mortality, a small change, from like 110 degrees to 114 degrees actually has a large effect on the number of people that die. And so that's important.
Good. One last question of you, Dr. Wehner, if I could. Then we'll turn it over to Senator Carper, who has been joined by 2 of our colleagues. Welcome, gentlemen. Dr. Wehner, as communities across our nation experience increasingly extreme weather events, resiliency and adaptation are front of mind for state and local officials. They are in Delaware and West Virginia, and I think every state that's represented here. Our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our pipes, our wires are essential to our daily lives, and they've got to be able to withstand more frequent and severe weather events. My question is, would you please share an example of how attribution science can inform the design and engineering of infrastructure projects to better manage the impacts of these extreme weather events when they occur?
Yes, Senator, I can. I had a project with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which I believe is the first time that a city actually funded research at a national laboratory. And the city of San Francisco is charged with rebuilding the wastewater management, the sewers. And they're charged with considering climate change in this. And they had people telling them about sea level rise. They asked me about extreme precipitation. And so what we did is we asked them to give us a dozen storms since the satellite era that were impactful, and we would take a look at them. And we were able to analyze 6 of those. And the atmospheric river storms that had the so-called bomb cyclone associated with them responded in a way that, again, I was surprised about twice the expected rate. And that was used by their consultants to modify their IDF curves. These are intensity, duration.
What are IDF curves?
Intensity, duration, and frequency. And it's a design tool that engineers use.
Thank you.
And that's the extent of my knowledge. I will quote what Susan Leal said, who was the former director of the Public Utilities Commission and now one of their consultants. And she said, and I quote, "There ain't no pipe big enough." And that has sent the engineers and designers back to the drawing room saying, how are we going to accommodate these storms that might, in a world that might be in a considerably warmer simulation.
Right. I'm going to ask you to hold it right there, and Dr. Jurado, I'm going to come back on my next round when I get to ask another question, and I'll ask you just to follow up on what he's already said. But now, Senator Carper, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dabbar, I love this one term that you used in your statement, technology neutral, innovation open. Because I think we need to focus on solutions. I mean, everybody's talked about it. So as one of the things that we've seen in the data, that mortality from natural disasters is significantly lower in more technologically advanced societies with access to energy and resilient infrastructure. Recent reports by reliability experts show that we as a nation are projected to go backwards on our grid reliability this decade, and many point to some regulations that will lead to early power plant retirements. We also see the rise of the electric economy that's being moved forward rather rapidly. So And everybody's mentioned that the most vulnerable are those that are in the lower economic echelon of our society, and that's troublesome, obviously, for me. So, how will extreme weather impact energy demand, and how do you think grid reliability will impact our vulnerability in these events?
Yes, Senator. So I agree with your point that grid reliability has actually been decreasing. I think the most stark example that most people don't know about is that there's actually been more power plant shutdowns in many areas of the country. New England is one, New York is another, Texas is another. It's really actually all over, in which more power plants are being decommissioned for various reasons and are being built. And the ones that are getting built have a lower capacity factor, so the number of megawatt hours is way lower. And so I think we should be concerned about that. That gets to regulatory processes and citing, whether it's state or federal, that in the kind of world that we're trying to electrify,
Right.
we're actually de-electrifying. And I think that's a long and complicated process that needs to be streamlined.
Okay, thank you. You know, we've had near-term emission reductions, and we are still, and will continue, I think everybody is in agreement on here, experience climate change impacts until globally our greenhouse gases are reduced. But it may continue then. You know, there's stuff we don't know, you know, that we don't know into our future. How do we create economic conditions for innovative solutions, for technology neutral, innovation open, that would increase our resilience and our disaster readiness? I mean, at the Department of Energy, you probably saw this, you probably see this as well, certainly overseeing the national labs. Dr. Wehner's at a national lab. Are there near-term technologies that can be deployed to improve our adaptation strategies?
Yes, Senator. So as I mentioned, we don't know, we cannot clearly see which technologies are going to be best. So having regulatory processes or mandates from states and so on that allow for those new things, instead of mandating we're only going to have this type of technology, we're only going to have EVs, we're only going to have nuclear, we're only going to have wind, whatever it is poor technology policy. And so we should be allowing all of those to be kind of neutrally supported, whether it's through EPA or state approvals or through funding. Because if you overly fund one area, you're going to get more of that. And being more neutral across that for regulatory and funding purposes is better technology policy.
Thank you. In terms of, you know, where we're headed, I thought it was interesting in your statement you mentioned that President Bush in, I guess, 2001 was trying to predict, his commission was trying to predict over 20 years where we're going to go. How do you see that accelerated now? I feel like we're on a much more accelerated path through some of the bills that we've passed. How do you see that developing? And are we the global leader here, or are there other technologies around the globe that we're looking at?
So America by far leads the world in energy discovery. Manufacturing is a different topic, but when it comes to energy discovery, America rules the roost on many different metrics. So there are many things. We are accelerating, Senator. There's a reason why that process has improved significantly. But you could look at California, or you could look at what's going on in Massachusetts. Fusion is much more likely than it used to be for various reasons, and many others. So I think the acceleration of discovery has dramatically improved. We're in a much better space on that front.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to go back to my first question when I talked about electricity reliability. I want to submit a letter from both, it's to Administrator Regan, from the chairman of the West Virginia Public Service Commission and the chairman of the Delaware Public Service Commission that is cautioning what the administration is doing on the Clean Power Plan to look at how it will impact our states.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I was reminded of in that exchange that just took place about, I think we can be proud as Americans that we're leading the pack in terms of addressing climate change. And there's a saying, I don't know if it's in the Bible or what, but to whom much is given, much is expected. And we are a nation richly blessed, as you know. And we are, frankly, the leader in terms of, over the time, putting emissions in the air that, in our planet that are actually leading to climate change and global warming. So given that we helped create this problem, we have about maybe an oversized obligation into addressing it. And I think we are. I think we are. We're doing good work in this panel. We're doing good work with this administration, and hopefully with the administration that comes in a whole bunch of people around the country. Thank you. Okay. We've been joined by Senator Markey. Senator Markey's been working on these vineyards for a long time, and we're delighted that he joined us along with Senator Bozeman and Senator Padilla. Senator Markey.
Thank you so much. So we're the first generation to suffer from climate change. We're the last generation which can do anything about it, so that's our challenge. And in answer to Senator Capito, yeah, in terms of innovation, up in Massachusetts, we have a center, it's called Greentown. There's 300 companies up there, all doing MIT, Harvard, Tufts-related research. And one of the companies is called Form Energy, which is actually creating a manufacturing plant down in West Virginia for 800 jobs for
Right,
next
Mr.
year.
Dabbar talked about that.
Excuse me?
Mr. Dabbar talked about that in his
Oh,
opening
you did?
statement.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so that's a perfect kind of partnership between kind of the innovation community up in Massachusetts, the manufacturing capacity in West Virginia, and there are many more companies up there who are looking at West Virginia, for example, for where they'll be doing the manufacturing. So to accelerate this, and by the way, their breakthrough is for batteries. It's not lithium ion, it's iron, I-R-O-N, which is going to be the battery, the third most common element in the world. Okay, so that's a big breakthrough in terms of battery technology. And there's just so much that is happening because of the IRA, the tax benefits that flow, and then the state of West Virginia or other states that then give additional benefits to manufacture there. So I think it's a good a team effort to accelerate this transformation. And just like many things historically, this year alone we've seen severe flooding and deadly heat waves, and we need to be able to do something about it. Dr. Jurado, you mentioned in your testimony that Melrose Park, a predominantly black neighborhood in Broward County, was disproportionately affected by flooding in April. Dr. Jurado, does effectively managing climate-fueled disasters, including flood management, mean prioritizing investment in infrastructure in neighborhoods that have suffered from chronic disinvestment for decades? Environmental justice communities like Melrose Park, would they be benefited?
Well, yes, Senator, absolutely. I mean, we're conducting, comprehensive modeling, overlaying vulnerability indices, really focusing on the combined impacts and exposures with flood risk, damages, heat exposures, economic conditions, economic burden, all of those things being overlaid. We're desperately concerned about uninsured losses. We saw with the April event, many residents lost their homes in addition to their vehicles. And in the circumstance of Melrose Park, this is a community that is not in a flood zone and has been hit twice in the last 6 years with this level of flood impact. So it's bringing to light these very dramatic exposures and the need to bring all of our community into the solutions to support their well-being.
And we know it's not a coincidence that disproportionately black, brown, and low-income communities are more likely to struggle with extreme weather events fueled by climate change. Dr. Wehner, in your research, do disasters fueled by climate change hit some neighborhoods harder than others? And does that drive increasing inequality resulting from climate injustices?
Yes, it certainly does. But I would caution that every event, every disaster is different and affected differently. I think the important point is that the very poor are indeed the most vulnerable because they're the least able to recover from these kinds of events. And so that's, I think, pretty obvious.
Yeah, it is obvious. And do you agree with the research that says that extreme weather events are up from 3 times per year in the United States in the 1980s to 20 per year now in the 2020s? Do you agree with that?
I might have written that.
So please expand, because obviously that's like a 7-fold increase in the number of extreme weather events in the United States over the last 40 years, and we know it hits poor people disproportionately, though it hits all people who are impacted.
Well, Senator Capito's made a point that climate change didn't cause these events, and I think that's something I completely agree with. We borrow from epidemiology techniques to sort of understand how climate change has affected these events. Now, some events, might be less frequent. Blizzards, for instance, in a warmer world, they've become rainstorms. But certainly for heat waves and violent rainstorms, like hurricanes or this one that hit Fort Lauderdale, are more frequent.
Well, let me ask it another way. NOAA data shows that disasters that caused more than $1 billion in damage rose from 3 per year in the 1980s to more than 20 a year in the 2020s. You agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
And Dr. Wehner, does climate attribution science show that fossil fuel pollution is underpinning this rapid increase in devastating, expensive disasters?
I would agree with that, too.
Okay, well, I think that's the important factor, okay? It's gone from 3 to 20. It's not all attributable to one thing, but from your research, it's the underpinning of the rapid increase. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and then we know that poor people are going to be ultimately disproportionately negatively impacted. So thank you so much, sir.
Senator Padilla, welcome. You're on. Thanks. We've been joined by Senator Whitehouse. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Good to be with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking a little bit to the choir here, but for the record, according to the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is a report from a congressionally mandated program, climate attribution studies have indicated that throughout the western United States, human-induced climate change is substantially reducing winter and spring snowpack, which is then increasing the likelihood of chronic drought. The report also indicates that under no change to water management practices, several important western U.S. snowpack reservoirs, including the Sierra Nevada and California, will effectively disappear by the end of the century. Dr. Wehner, as a contributor to the assessment, can you walk us through the impact of snowpack loss for California and other western states?
Yes, Senator, I can. In fact, that research was initially performed by Dr. Alan Rhodes at Berkeley Lab when he was a graduate student. And in that work, basically, if we continue on a business as usual or a no policy scenario of emissions, by the end of the century, the snowpack in the Sierra would be effectively gone, as it would also in the Wasatch Mountains, which is an important source of water for Utah and Salt Lake City. And so in California and throughout the West, we rely on the snowpack as a temporary reservoir and to supply water for both agricultural needs and for our urban requirements. And that infrastructure was built over the past century and was assuming that the snow would melt on a schedule that was, in the past. And that has changed. There are studies that show that the snow melt is begun earlier. And as that continues, it will overwhelm our ability to manage water, so we will run out, in the latter parts of the, before it starts snowing again, or raining again.
Right, it just compounds the effect of, this last winter was an anomaly, so when we have less precipitation, earlier, quicker runoff, that leads to very difficult scenarios later in the summer and early fall, each and every year with growing populations and a growing economy. So just laying that out for my colleagues, we need to do different going forward, and we need both policy and investments, building on what we've done with the Inflation Reduction Act, building on what we've done with the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, Speaking of precipitation, I do want to also acknowledge the historic storm events that took place this last winter that illustrated our nation's vulnerability to heavy precipitation and flooding when we get what little rain that we do get too much too quickly. Atmospheric river rainstorms are responsible for nearly 85% of flooding on the West Coast, which threatened our vital infrastructure and vulnerable communities. In California specifically, we had 9 successive atmospheric rivers in January, which caused flooding, power outages, and mudslides, resulting in an estimated $4.6 billion worth of damages. I lay that out because it's important to get the data to better understand what we're grappling with here so we can inform how we adapt and how we respond. So I was actually glad to see the President's supplemental request funding for NOAA's acquisition of 2 Hurricane Hunter aircraft replacements, which is something that both Senator Graham and I, both members of the committee, pushed hard on. These planes can help provide real-time data from inside atmospheric rivers to increase vital decision-making, which is important to protect life and property. Dr. Wehner, back to you. In your testimony, you mentioned that climate attribution research in heat waves and hurricanes is more advanced. Can you talk more about the need for research and development around atmospheric river events?
Well, indeed, the literature on hurricanes is long and detailed, although we don't know everything, obviously, about hurricanes. Atmospheric rivers weren't even named such until about 20 years ago. And so it's a much younger field of research, and there's much more to be done. And in fact, what you mentioned about sending airplanes out into these storms has only just begun, but that's really critical to get that kind of data so we understand why some of these disturbing findings that we've found about atmospheric rivers, particularly the ones that are associated with the so-called bomb cyclones, have such a sensitive response, a large response in their precipitation mounts from climate change.
So, thank you. And I know my time is up. I'll just end with this. Having been briefed post these atmospheric river events earlier this year, a lot of the impact on the ground to communities, particularly vulnerable communities, were a result of the atmospheric river storms not behaving as they were initially predicted. Again, because of the lack of research historically when it comes to atmospheric rivers. So the quicker and better we can understand how they're more likely to behave, whether they just stay stationary over a certain geographic area or move further north, south, east, west, depending on greater climate factors, the more we can prepare to protect life and property on the ground. So appreciate all your research and testimony here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Dr. Jurado, I'm a senator from Rhode Island, a fellow ocean state, so I think I'll focus my questions on you. I gather you are seeing continuing and increasing tidal flooding, sometimes referred to as sunny day flooding, that has nothing to do with a rainstorm, but has to do with sea level rise and tidal action.
Yes, Senator, absolutely. I think that these events were first observed maybe with increased regularity about 10 years ago. Then we began to see longer fall tidal flooding. Now the flooding also occurs into the spring months. So you can really set your clock by the expansiveness and frequency of these events. They're particularly compounding flood conditions because when it rains and we're having this high tide flooding, none of our flat landscape can drain. We actually find tidal flooding contributing to inland flooding miles inside the county because of the interconnectedness of these systems.
You jumped ahead to my next question, so well done. So if you are nowhere near the coast in Rhode Island, but you are potentially in a riparian zone near a river that's going by or a canal that's going by, you could well be flooded with fresh water because of the sea level rise creating hydraulic back pressure on the escape of that fresh water from Florida's land surfaces.
That's exactly the condition. In fact, some of our most western communities, we see tidal signals in the canal network that are 15 miles inland. And so that increase in water level that carries through the entire network is not constrained to the coast by any means. But clearly the most severe impacts are happening in the coastal area, but that can extend 6 miles inland. And it's not only affecting what happens with surface water flooding, but we also find a rise in the groundwater table that's extending 6 miles inland as well. And that affects all of the drainage infrastructure associated with site development, roadways, transportation projects as a whole.
And along with the rise in the groundwater from effectively hydraulic sea level rise pressure, are you also seeing that salt water is intruding through the limestone into what previously were freshwater wells and water sources for homes and businesses?
That, too, is absolutely the case. We've estimated that we lost about 30% of the coastal wells or will to saltwater intrusion by about the year 2050, 2060. We partnered with Palm Beach County to develop a very large surface water reservoir as an alternative water supply holding 35 million gallons of water to help compensate for what's happening with saltwater intrusion. It's very much driving the practices as we look at long-term water supply investments, and impacts on our wastewater collection system as well, because that water is driving into those connections.
And is the warming of the ocean offshore, including measured up to literally jacuzzi recommended temperatures, causing an effect on the strength of storms that hit Florida, particularly hurricane level storms that come from the ocean?
Well, I believe that the science has well documented that the warming is causing an intensification of these systems that contributes to additional rainfall, that these storms move more slowly, they carry more rain, they dump more water on communities, and so those impacts are very real, in addition to the environmental consequences for the reefs, which are suffering under 100 plus temperatures. I think we're very much interested in looking at, in addition, how much of this additional warming is going to drive sea level in the short term, and what types of measures can we take to really work to constrain the upper limit on sea level rise. In addition to just talking about temperature, what can we do to really drive a cap on how much we're willing to accommodate an additional rise in sea level, and as it impacts our infrastructure?
How's the insurance industry responding to all these new risks?
Well, certainly we've seen sizable adjustments in what's happening with flood insurance policies, and then we have our windstorm and policies on top of that. I shared at a roundtable at the White House a couple of weeks ago, while the national average on homeowners policies is about $1,400, most of the people I know in Florida are paying about $8,000 a year currently, and that's just windstorm, not counting flood.
And from what I understand, nearly a dozen local insurance companies have gone bankrupt, facing claims. Others have stopped renewing policies in order to avoid future risk. National companies are walking away entirely from Florida markets, and there's a resulting flood, if you wish, to a flight, I guess would be the better way to call it, to your state-backed insurance company. How much of a burden do you think your state-backed Citizens Property Insurance Company will end up carrying?
It's hard to say, but currently the Citizens program is trying to depopulate, and I know that many are receiving notices that they're required to consider these alternative policies, and one I read about just recently was a 450% increase in the annual premium to move to the private to a private holder. So the options are significantly reduced. The costs are escalating beyond a level of affordability, and I think that it's one of the most treacherous conditions affecting home ownership and the ability to live in South Florida, where we need people to be able to work and prosper. They can't even afford an annual insurance premium.
Thanks very much. I've gone over my time. I appreciate the indulgence of my colleagues. I'd only add that when I last checked, Citizens Property Insurance had reserves of $4 billion. Idalia so far is over $10 billion. Hurricane Ian was over $110 billion. So there's an enormous gap there.
There certainly is. Thank you, Sheldon. All right, Senator Merkley, good to see you. Welcome. Delighted you joined us.
Thank you very much, and I wanted to continue the impact on insurance because I picture middle-class families who have a mortgage, and their mortgage generally says, you must maintain homeowner insurance. And so the family gets a notice saying, sorry, we're canceling your homeowner insurance. And the family has to go out and find a separate homeowner insurance. Otherwise, the mortgage company will put the homeowner insurance on a very, very expensive policy. But it becomes increasingly hard to find that. So our middle-class families really in the middle of a mortgage, they're not buying a new house, if you will, finding that they're in trouble in terms of securing the insurance they need to maintain their mortgage in good standing?
I think that the circumstance, thank you, Senator, is one of again, affordability. I mean, there's a lot of conversation of people simply needing to move out of the area because they can't afford the insurance options that allow them to afford their mortgage payment, that allow them to stay in their home. Most recently as well, the Citizens insurance provider has also required flood insurance coupled with the hurricane coverage. And so again, it's another cost that somebody who was able to barely afford a mortgage at the time at which they secured it may be just in a situation of having to let go. And we do see many individuals leaving the state as a result.
Yeah. Well, we do see in Oregon a lot of families affected by flood insurance issues. But I really wanted to focus, as I think, when you think about Oregon and climate chaos, you might hear people talk about the pine beetle infestation. You might hear them talk about the decreasing snowpack in the Cascades, which has dropped by average of 240 inches over 90 years. So basically half the snowpack is gone. You might hear them talk about ocean acidification affecting the sea life off our coast, and we have one of the richest grounds of the combination of the Pacific upwelling and the California current. But the thing that really is on people's minds are fires. We have seen such a growth in forest fires. And in 2020, we had 3 simultaneous fires in 3 major watersheds. We had the San Am Canyon fire, the Alameda fire, the South Oberchain, and Echo Mountain, well, more than 3, but essentially we lost 4,000 homes. I traveled 600 miles up and down the state, never got out of the smoke. You had massive collapse of communities turning up at the fairgrounds in refugee status, and seeing the burnt remains of towns. Some 12 different towns were either obliterated or deeply damaged by those fires. And I think maybe this is more for you, Dr. Wehner, if I'm pronouncing your name right. People used to talk about 100-year events, and now they talk about 1,000-year events. I think you framed it in your testimony that things that occurred every 1,500 years have become once-in-century events. Anyway, the things that are very rare are happening with increasing frequency. You didn't mention in your testimony wildfires as a category of extreme weather which can be attributed with reasonable certainty. What can science or client attribution science tell us about individual wildfires?
It can tell us quite a bit, Senator. I was the chapter lead author on Chapter 8 of the 4th National Climate Assessment, Volume 1, which fires was part of that chapter. And that was back in 2017, and we saw a clear trend, particularly in Washington, Oregon, and California, of large wildfires, an increasing trend. That, of course, is much worse since 2017. There have been a lot of major fires in all those states. In anticipation of your question, I did do a little more research last night, trying to find specific things to Oregon, and I don't have one. I have some more general statements, though. The leaders in this actually turned out to be Environment Canada and Victoria, and they've, of course, studied Canadian fires, but that's not all that different than Oregon. And they found that the fire weather metrics that led to that big fire in 2018 in British Columbia were made 2 to 4 times more likely. And and more importantly, that the area of the fire was increased by a factor of 7 to 11. So it became a much, record kind of fire. And in California, another paper found...
The fire is 7 to 11 times more destructive?
It was, the area burned was 7 times larger, at least. Another study said that nearly all of the observed increase of the burned area in California over the past half century is attributable to anthropogenic climate change. And so I'm sure that this is true in Oregon as well. Fire is very difficult and perhaps one of the more challenging areas for event attribution because there are, as all these kinds of extreme events, multiple causes. Wind is an instigator. And one of the things that my research and some others have found is that there's little trend in extreme wind. And so this increase in fire weather conditions is almost entirely due to higher temperatures drying out the fuel, the forests, so that the fire seasons are longer. And this is also reflected in the budgets of wildfire fighters, and that we have to pay more because they're out there longer.
Yeah. We used to, if you were asking an Oregonian 20 years ago when to come to Oregon, they're like, oh, well, July, August into early September are our golden time. And now if you ask Oregonians, so they'll kind of pause and go, we've had a lot of smoke in July and August and September. I mean, it's just a huge change. We have furniture stores that can't sell their inventory because of smoke damage. We have wine grapes that have been contaminated by smoke damage. We have people in the hospital with asthma aggravated by smoke. We have communities trying to set up clean air sectors. In other words, it's so palpable, like the change within a few decades is so real. If you're trying to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, and the through hikers that used to come through in August, cannot come through. There are so many fires on the Pacific Crest Trail and or near it, threatening it. And my wife and I have had to change our plans a number of times for those hikes. And you don't want to be in the middle of the wilderness with no cell phone connection or knowledge of fires erupting and be in a very remote trail. It's so many dimensions of our life in Oregon been affected. The Ashland Shakespeare Festival, huge challenge with cancellations due to air smoke quality. So it's very important for us to be able to capture this. We've seen the fire season grow longer. That one set of fires in Labor Day 2020 burned over 1 million acres and 4,000 homes and a dozen communities affected. It sent a very powerful message. People across the country, they remember Paradise, California. Well, the devastation was greater in Oregon, but it was like, oh, well, now it's like not new, like devastating fires that burn a community to the ground, and you see, cast iron bathtubs and steel staircases still standing just in beds of ashes, and molybdenum wheels where they melted and ran across the ground, creating strange sculptures. I mean, it's an architecture that we've just never witnessed before, or a scene we've never witnessed. So I think understanding this continued impact is incredibly important. Thank you all for bringing your insights to bear on the evolution of the dynamics in many dimensions, certainly floods, droughts, and fires. Thank you.
Thanks for those very thoughtful questions. We're going to start a second round here. You're both welcome to stick around if you can and want to, and have another shot. I want to go back to Dr. Jurado. You may remember if we had a question earlier, and I said I was going to come back and ask you to pick it up. I think the question I'd ask was of Dr. Wehner. I asked him if he would give us an example or two of how attribution science can inform the design and engineering of infrastructure projects to better manage the impacts of these extreme events when they occur. And I just want to ask for Dr. Jurado, for you, as chief, are you the chief resilience officer for Broward County? You are, aren't you, right?
Correct.
Yeah. How important is it to have scientific information about the size of events that we may be faced with next? How important is that? And how can the results of attribution studies inform local infrastructure planning and decision making?
Thank you. It's an absolute criticality. One of the greatest challenges that we faced in South Florida was trying to account for rainfall intensification. We knew it was taking place, and we have to be able to accommodate this additional volume of rainfall. If a 1 in a 100-year event used to deliver 13 inches, but now it delivers 15 or 18, it alters the whole of infrastructure across the community, not just how we plan locally, but the integration with all of the state-funded and federally funded, projects as well. So we need to have harmonization across infrastructure, and we need to know with certainty, at a decent level of certainty, what's the percent change that we should be accommodating in our infrastructure for this intensification. So we worked very deliberately with our federal agency partners to account for initially a 13% increase in rainfall, ultimately made that adjustment to 20%. So this 20% intensification for rainfall events is now embedded in the design standards that we have for drainage infrastructure, surface water management infrastructure. We're ensuring that the improvements to the CNSF project also account for this rainfall intensification. It drives our flood elevations. So absolutely, we needed to be able to embed this not in the various types of design infrastructure, and then be able to account for how it influences change in groundwater table, plus the flood elevation, plus the conveyance and storage needs. Very critical. And having that information allows us to not only design appropriately, but also consider to the extent to which our mitigation activities in terms of reducing emissions and decreasing the intensity of these events can work to make a longer-term difference over the course of the next several decades. How much of that can we mitigate through our emissions improvements?
All right, thank you. Thanks for that. I'm going to come back to Dr. Wehner for another question, one dealing with beliefs and attitudes. In fact, let me just hold off on that. We've been joined by one of the two retired Navy captains who serve in the United States Senate these days, and a former astronaut, a guy who's done all kinds of stuff with his life, a guy who married up, as I did, and his name's Mark Kelly. Mark, thank you for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly married up, with no doubt about that. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, and I apologize for running a little late. Every summer in Arizona, it's hot. We know that. But this year, the heat wave hit a whole new level. In the month of July, Phoenix had a 31-day streak where the average temperature was above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 31 days in a row. And in total, we had in Phoenix 55 days above 110 this summer. And that's unprecedented. But one stat that I saw describing this summer's heat stands out above the rest, and I was just looking at a plot. This is a couple months ago, and this is actually a global plot on worldwide temperature. And when you look at the summer of 2023, it kind of stands out. And data from the Copernicus Climate Change Service found that the average global temperature, which is what I'm talking about, when I looked at this, it was a 3 sigma variation, 3 standard deviations away from the norm. And to me, as somebody who used to do a lot of stuff with data as a test pilot, could be a bad data point. Could be. But temperature is a pretty easy thing to measure. So in my view, and in my mind, it's either bad data, which it's not, or something very unusual has happened. That same data shows that in July and August of this year, we were 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than pre-industrial levels. So Dr. Wehner, when we see data like this, how easy or difficult is it to attribute all or even part of this to a change in the climate? And when we see data increases like the change in summer temperatures from last year to this one, it's sometimes hard to communicate why this is such a big deal. So how does climate attribution shape the ways that we talk about the impact of climate change on data? If you can address those.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, this year is a particularly unusual one. And Arizona wasn't the only place that had a heat wave. At the same time, we had heat waves in the United States, we had heat waves in Europe and China all simultaneously. And that's part of the reason why so the whole northern hemisphere was hot. And that's part of the reason why the global mean is a 3 sigma event. Now, some of that is going to be an El Nino effect, and we can quantify that, but not nearly all of it. And so some also, part of it is quite clearly the anthropogenic effect, the human-caused effect from our consumption of fossil fuels and our changes to the composition of the atmosphere.
Dr. Wehner, can I just ask you, if you go back decades or over the last 100 years, has there been another 3 sigma event in temperature?
Not that I'm aware of, but my knowledge isn't complete on that. So it's an unusual event. This is, when I was coaching ice hockey, I'd call this, in the words of the great basketball coach John Wooden, a teachable moment. This is a teachable moment for many of us, including climate scientists, so that we can better understand that. And attribution science is probably the key to understanding how all these different factors led to this 3 sigma event.
So part of it could be El Nino.
Some of it certainly is called El Nino. Some of it could be natural.
But we've had El Ninos.
We've had El Ninos in the past. Of course.
What's the cycle on an El Nino?
It's every 4 to 7 years.
4 to 7.
But 1998 was another huge El Nino year, and then years afterwards were cooler. And I had to write papers afterwards, saying, the title of the paper is the climate warming or cooling, and it's because people were saying, well, climate change stopped. And so it's important to look, that's wrong, of course. You can't just start your analysis in the hottest time of the year or hottest data point. And so...
Yeah, the CO2, methane, carbon monoxide didn't vanish from the atmosphere.
No. And so the longer the data records, the more informative it is.
And do you expect future 3 sigma events to occur more frequently?
That I cannot say. I don't think we understand changes in variability nearly as well as we do changes in the average. But I certainly can tell you that this summer event, throughout the world was unusual, but it will be the norm in a very short period of time.
And do you feel that the messaging in the United States and across the planet on this issue and this 3 sigma event is sufficient? Or do you feel like maybe media and others are falling short?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. To me, the data always speaks for itself, but I'm not an expert on media relations, and so I think I'll defer on that question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't, when I saw the data, it was just happened, I was reading, an article and just saw the plot, and it was like, my reaction was, wow, that's different.
One of the things one of my colleagues and I are working on is, would this temperature been impossible without climate change? Would this past summer been impossible without climate change? And, give me a few more months and we'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, please let me know. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Thank you. Did you say, Dr. Wehner, that you're an ice hockey coach?
Yes. I coached teenagers. It was fun.
You still do it?
Not any longer.
Senator Kelly, thanks for joining
I
us.
can't skate anymore, unfortunately.
Who do you think was maybe the greatest hockey player who ever played the sport?
Oh, Wayne Gretzky.
Wayne Gretzky was once asked, Mr. Gretzky, why are you the greatest hockey player on the planet? And he replied famously, as you probably recall, he said, I go where the puck will be, not where the puck is. Think about that. I go where the puck will be, not where the puck is. It's a little bit like attribution science. So, we're going to help figure out where the puck's going to be and to be able to address it. It works pretty well. I was just coming back to you, Dr. Wehner, for some follow-up questions. And we may be joined by another colleague or two. I think every other committee in the Senate is meeting almost at the same time. We have a big forum, bipartisan forum going on right now on AI, artificial intelligence. And this is our hearing here today. So we have some people who would like to be here, just can't be here, but they're very much interested. And some are watching. I think this is being televised live. And some are watching it along with their staffs. So the impact that you're having is probably far greater than you might imagine. So it's really important. I want to finish my question of you, and then I'll tell a story, and then we'll maybe wrap it up. But I was saying earlier when we were joined by one of our colleagues, I said in a recent poll on attitudes toward climate change, 55% of Americans said they had not personally felt the effects of climate change. During the July heat wave that Senator Kelly and others have alluded to, however, two-thirds of the U.S. population were under heat alerts and other climate-driven events, from wildfires to hurricanes, and that harmed a lot of folks. It's worth noting that only 5% of TV news coverage of the heat wave even mentioned climate change. How about that? Even mention climate change. So I think that attribution science provides an opportunity to help Americans understand that what they are experiencing is actually the effect of climate change. It's not their imagination. It's not something that may or may not be happening. It's actually explainable. As you explained in your testimony, Dr. Wehner, attribution studies detail the effects of climate change on extreme weather events. What are some specific ways that we can use this information to help the public better understand how climate change impacts their daily lives?
Well, I think there's
Joe Biden has, he and I have a lot of sayings that we swap back and forth with one another. We rode the trains together to D.C. for years, and I think I know every one of his, and he knows all of mine. But one of my favorite Biden words is splainer, as in explainer. He's always looking for good splainers. I've always tried to, and I'm surrounded on either side by good splainers, but we're looking for ways that we can be better splainers. So how do we do a better job of helping the public understand how climate change impacts their daily lives?
Well, in some sense, that is my job, is to try to put numbers on what has mainly this past few years become very painfully obvious. Maybe you don't even need me to tell you that the climate's changing and that weather's getting worse. I mean, all you have to do is pay attention. I mean, we talked about fires. I've lived in California now for almost 40 years, and I don't remember bad air days like we've had. I have a photograph taken from near my house where the sky was orange, and orange like an unnatural orange, like orange soda. It was apocalyptic. It was frightening. You don't need to be a climate scientist to know that that's weird and that's unusual. These heat waves, have affected a lot of people. They've killed a lot of people. They've killed a lot of people's grandparents. I mean, I think that's, a very personal and very distressing thing if that were to happen. These storms, Hurricane Ian in Florida was a very devastating storm. We wrote recently that climate change made the storm 20% wetter, but that's only part of the damages. We had this huge storm surge in Fort Myers, like 15 or 20 feet, that wiped homes right off their foundations. And then a few days later, the fresh water, the rainfall ran through the systems and flooded a large number of homes outside of Tampa. And so, the insurance rates are an issue. I mean, that's an issue in California. Mine went from $2,000 to $5,000, my own. And so, it's how this information is used, I think, is a question for you. I can tell you what happened and what's going to happen, or what our best guess is what's going to happen. But what we do about it is, is not something I decide. That is something that the people decide through their elected representatives.
Thank you. I want to follow up with Dr. Jurado. How could policymakers and the media more effectively communicate this information that we're talking about here to the public?
Thank you for the question. I think that the media conversation is a significant one. It's interesting. I've been in D.C., over the years, and hear meteorologists, I don't know on which channel, but speaking about climate change as part of the weather delivery. When it happens, it's almost stunning. Why aren't our weather forecasters integrating discussion of climate as part of the weather forecast? When was the last time that we collectively looked at the CO2 concentrations at Mauna Loa? I remember when it passed 400 parts per million. Do we ever talk about having lost that benchmark and where we're going, and how these conditions relate to on-the-ground effects? Government at the local level, we are not the best communicators. We need assistance with this. No matter how many presentations we give and websites that we deliver, the majority of the public are not aware of the conversation or the amount of work that's taking place. So I think it is about recognizing impacts, celebrating wins, celebrating investments, talking about the change in individual circumstance that comes with investing in resilience, broadcasting the types of programs that are available because of the concerns that are being expressed, providing more funding for the types of projects. The EPA's, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, great start, but $4.3 billion across all of the communities in the United States is just, it's one shot at a much larger problem that we have in terms of helping residents adapt and celebrating the types of investments that are making quality of life improvements as climate change is taking place.
Thanks for that response. As if things couldn't get any busier, the Senate is now beginning to vote. So we have all these hearings going on, this big forum, bipartisan forum that's going on AI, and we're trying to solve climate change here for the morning. Senator Capito has gone to vote, and I don't know that she's going to be able to come back and finish up with another round of questions. I have one or two more that I'm going to ask, and then we'll wrap it up. One of the closing questions I'll ask for you just to think about this is, I talked about ice hockey. I'm going to use a baseball metaphor, telegraphing my pitch. You can tell in baseball how the way the pitcher holds the ball maybe delivers the baseball to the batter. You can tell what kind of pitch it is: fastball, curveball, slider. But I'm going to tell you my pitch to you. I'm going to ask a question. Where do we agree? Where do the three of you agree that maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago there wouldn't have been as much agreement in this room at this table? There used to be one of the ranking members here was a fellow named Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma, who was a climate change denier, and he would have readily admitted. I remember when it snowed here one time, it was like in warm weather, it snowed, and we had, 6 inches of snow on the lawn in front of the Capitol. He went out and he made snowballs, and he brought the snowballs, I think, onto the Senate floor and said, the climate change, well, I don't believe that's real. Look at these snowballs here in August. And by the time he left here, and he was a senior Republican on this committee, he was my lead Republican on the Diesel Emission Reduction Act. So, then people can change their minds. They can learn. Real quick question, Dr. Jurado, and then we'll move toward wrapping it up. Question about how Inflation Reduction Act programs boost resiliency. The Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I'm proud to say were largely written in this room. But in any event, they included programs to help states, programs to help tribes, to help cities, help counties reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to improve their resiliency. One example is the EPA's climate pollution reduction grants. And my question, Dr. Jurado, is, does your community down in Broward County, does your community want and need this federal assistance? And a follow-up question to that is, how are you using federal grant programs and clean energy tax credits? Mm-hmm. And is this assistance sufficient for communities to address climate change by driving down emissions and increasing resilience?
Thank you for the question,
Sure.
Senator. The support is absolutely needed. I'm sure that many are aware that our state passed on the CPRG funding and most recently on the solar project funding for residential investment. If that money is not made directly available to communities, meaning municipalities, tribes, and counties, many of us will not be able to take advantage of these very critically needed investments, and there frankly aren't alternative funding sources. Another challenge that we have is we have no investment in energy efficiency by our local energy utility. There are no programs, and the statement is made that it's not cost effective. Well, it's not cost effective for the utility provider, but no matter how clean the energy is that's being produced, you still have many lower income individuals who are contending with significant rise in temperature. They're already energy burdened, and many are struggling with how to provide air conditioning just to sleep through the night. You have older individuals who need that cooling. Children cannot sleep and study well if they don't have an opportunity for their bodies to cool at night. The CPRG funding, that Climate Pollution Reduction Act funding, is critical for being able to aid with investments that help energy efficiency in single-family, multifamily residences that need that support. We're also very eager to take advantage of that funding to support solid waste improvements, where we have clean energy initiatives with waste-to-energy plants and those investments that are taking place in our community. It is a great initial start. We hope to see that funding renewed or a continuation of that funding in some form. We know that those plans that are underway will be ignited with this initial investment, but the plans that are being worked on by our communities are intended to go far beyond the next 5 years, and continued investment there would go a long ways to helping meet our own goals, which include net zero by 2050. In addition, with regards to the direct pay tax credits, certainly in our Broward County, we've been looking for innovative models to help support renewable energy projects over the years. We have maybe 14, 15 very large-scale solar projects, but these tax credits are now allowing us to increase the size of our solar projects by 30% beyond what we could have otherwise. So it's a tremendous benefit to our ability to participate proactively with clean energy solutions that are coupled with our infrastructure and our sites, as well as electric vehicle charging networks, transitions within our fleets, support for community and local government projects.
All right, thanks. Thank you for that response. I telegraphed my pitch. I said I was going to ask before we adjourn that where do y'all agree? Where do you think there's a consensus here in this panel that we might not have had it in this room at a similar hearing a couple of years ago? Where I won't ask you what's happened, but I could ask you what's happened here. Let me just start with Mr. Duhai. Go ahead, if you would, please.
Yes, Senator. So I think as we collect more data and look at new solutions, I think that's a consensus driver. I think coming out of the sequester, very large bipartisan support for innovation, which have led to a lot of these technologies like Form Energy and others that we've been talking about here today. I would like to comment to the data aspect of fire that was brought up previously. So there are solutions, right? And once again, we have these problems, but there are solutions. So let me give you one example around data and solutions on fire, which is you could use, I ran the National Quantum Initiative for the United States. You could use the photons on the fiber that go down the power lines, and you can detect the power quality and ergo the resistance of the power lines, and you can predict when they're going to fall. We haven't been able to do that. So using quantum networking and quantum sensing for these things going on in California and elsewhere, you could use that sort of new technology and detect meter by meter as the resistance of that line is degrading, and you could go fix it before the line falls. So this is an example of innovation that I think, back to your question, Senator, around consensus, right? I think the consensus around innovation, American leadership, things like the example I just gave you that would probably save lots of lives in Hawaii or California or elsewhere. I think that's part of the reason why things are moving forward.
Good, yeah. Dr. Wehner, same question, please, if you would.
I think we're in agreement on a lot of things. John Holdren, who was the science advisor for President Obama, said we have three choices. We can mitigate, we can adapt, or we can suffer. And I'd like to minimize the suffering, and that means we have to mitigate more and adapt more. And so the things that Mr. Dabbar has talked about in terms of making our energy systems more, reducing the emissions of these technologies is something that this country can lead in, and I strongly support that. But I think we also have to recognize that no matter what we do, we're going to be continuing to experience more severe and more frequent weather disasters, and so we need to adapt. One thing I did not get to say with the fires in particular is, all of us, myself included, are exposed to this smoke. The eastern part of the United States this year was exposed for the first time, I think, to the levels that Westerners are used to. I'm particularly concerned about the effect on children. And I raised this with a local politician recently, and he told me something I didn't know, that there is a program in California to distribute HEPA air filters to families in need. And I think that kind of actions are things that are really necessary if we're to protect our most vulnerable, and especially our children.
Good, great. Thank you for that. Dr. Jurado?
I think that as we've moved on through time, we just see more in the way of personal impacts, friends and family that have been impacted in one way or another. It becomes undeniable that these conditions are being more broadly experienced. We've also, though, I think, appreciated with time that there is a great ability to take advantage of an opportunity to innovate, to look at the economic opportunity that comes with new technology, new investments, community betterment, areas where we needed to make investments anyway, but we can add to the benefits being delivered. And so it isn't just about adaptation, it's about economic innovation and really embracing an opportunity to create a much better future through coupled investments that address energy and adaptation and community betterment and economic opportunity all tied together. So I think being able to look at it as not just a burden or exposure, but an opportunity for repositioning our communities at the same time.
Thank you. Let me think about it. Before we close, I think Senator White House is trying to get back here. He's already voted. I need to go vote very shortly. Our staffs, Democrat and Republican staffs, have heard me tell this story before, so I'll ask their indulgence. But I like to take the train. I love the train, and take the train a lot up and down the Northeast Corridor. Albert Einstein used to take the train a lot too. I think he taught at Princeton, but he'd get on the train at Princeton. He'd go to New York. He'd come down here, and he's a regular on the train, just much like Joe Biden and I have been over the years. One day he got on the train and found a seat, and he started looking for his ticket. And he reached in his pockets and his trousers and his briefcase. He couldn't find his ticket. And finally the conductor came up to him and said, Dr. Einstein, you ride the train a lot. We know who you are. Don't worry about it. We know who you are. And Dr. Einstein kept looking for his ticket. And the conductor walked away. And the conductor started to walk into the next car. And he turned around and he looked back, and Dr. Einstein was down on his hands and knees looking for his ticket. And the conductor rushed back. He said, Dr. Einstein, you don't have to do this. We know who you are. We know who you are. And Dr. Einstein looked up at the conductor on his hands and knees. He looked up at the conductor. He said, I know who I am, too. I just don't know where I'm going. I just don't know where I'm going. I think we know where we're going if we don't, work together, pull together, use science to guide us. And I must say, I wish you could all have been here when I've been on this committee 22 years. I wanted to be on this committee when I got here 22 years ago. Here's Sheldon. But to have heard the kind of conversations we had then on climate change compared to what we've had. This has been an incredibly constructive conversation, and I applaud each of you for taking the time to join us. Everything, as proud as I am of the work we've done in the Inflation Reduction Act and the work we've done on climate change provisions within the bipartisan infrastructure bill, everything I do, everything we do, we can do better. Everything we do, we can do better. And it's one thing to write legislation, to get it signed into law. The really important piece now is implementation. And one of the things that Senator Whitehouse and my colleague, Senator Capito, are interested in doing is making sure we do a good job on the implementation. And we don't just write legislation on this committee. We actually help implement. We do oversight. And we need to do a whole lot of that in the days going forward. So I will. I'm going to hand the gavel over to Senator Whitehouse. I leave it in good hands. But folks around the country think we don't like each other here. Democrats, Republicans hate each other. We never want to work together. I have people who say to me, like at least every week, Sheldon, when I'm getting on the train station, and I get on a train here up in Delaware, people say, "Can't you guys just work together? Can't you work together? Can't you do work to get something done?" And I wish they could have sat through this hearing. They might have been encouraged a little bit, because I think we have a pretty good idea of what's wrong, and we have a lot of good ideas about how to address it. And if the American people would hear that, I think they would be encouraged. There was once a woman who ran for president not that long ago, and her campaign slogan was "Stronger Together." Stronger together, and I think that certainly applies here. And I think that we're largely together, and we're stronger because of that. And I just love getting things done. I love getting things done, and we're getting some good things done. And if we say keep this attitude going, we'll do better still. Thank you for what you do with your lives, and thank you for joining us today. And with that, a fellow who does great things with his lives. He's from a small state, who, as we know from Delaware, small states do great things, and they produce, at least in his state's case, great legislators. Sheldon.
Small coastal states are the best, I think.
I'm going to run and vote, pal.
I can agree.
I'm going to ask you to
I will close out the hearing after my questions. I just wanted to go back to Dr. Jurado again because of the experience that you have had. In Rhode Island, our CZMA agency, the Coastal Resources Management Council, took a look at the FEMA flood maps and determined that they were defective. And we've seen, for instance, in the Houston flooding, that it hit about 50% accuracy rate. So FEMA really, I think, seriously needs to upgrade its mapping. What has been your experience in your geographic area with respect to FEMA flood mapping and its predictive quality?
Well, thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I know that when our last FEMA flood map, well, let me say two things. First of all, FEMA utilizes our Broward County's hydrologic model. We developed our fully integrated surface groundwater model. FEMA has used our model. They've improved our model. The South Florida Water Management District has used our model and improved the model, and now we're utilizing the same model again. So we have the benefit of all of us utilizing the same model for existing planning as well as future, existing conditions and future conditions planning. The last time we had a map update, interestingly—
Just to interject for 1 second.
Yes.
In working on future conditions, you take things like climate change and resulting sea level rise and storm severity into account.
Yes, sir. In fact, right now in our current modeling effort, we're evaluating 2 and 3 foot sea level rise scenarios, carrying the modeling out to 2070. It's actually 3.3 feet of sea level rise. We account for the change in the groundwater table. We account for the high tide condition under each of those sea level rise scenarios. We account for various storm surge conditions, including 25, 50, 100-year storm surge, and we couple that with a variety of what we call design storm events. So 10, 25, 50, 100-year rainfall conditions, and look at the compound flooding under all of those scenarios. And so we're utilizing that now as the basis for our county-wide water management planning and redevelopment strategies. So how far can we adapt through infrastructure investments and development approaches versus how much can we not address, such as with a 1 in 1,000-year rainfall event. There's going to be some element of flooding that we, again, just can't build a large enough pipe or have enough storage area. But with the FEMA flood mapping, I know at the time of our last update, we actually had 60% of the existing parcels that were removed from the map. Our engineers would say that that map, by and large, more accurately reflected current condition today flooding, only because of a lot of refinements in the data. It was just better data, like LIDAR data that came into the modeling effort. However, just like Melrose Park, still have communities that are not in a flood zone, which is always the case, that are still vulnerable to flooding. So we knew, though, that when those 60% of those parcels moved out, that they would come right back in as climate conditions continue to evolve. So we actually use our own future conditions flood map. That is not, we use a variety of tools for setting finished floor elevations. FEMA is one, but we require the highest of all of our tools be used for planning. And we have a future conditions flood map that integrates much of what I just described as one of those tools. So in many areas of the county, we're not relying upon the FEMA flood map. The FEMA flood map is most impressive where it's now been incorporates the coastal A zone. And in the distinction there was that we account for sea level rise, but hadn't accounted for storm surge. FEMA was accounting for storm surge, but not sea level rise, and that's why this current modeling effort is so critical, because it brings everything together.
So the multi-party effort has been a significant improvement over FEMA alone in the wild doing mapping.
Improving the models with time and everyone jointly utilizing the same models, but also integrating future conditions, because we have to account for risk tomorrow, not just the risk today for all of our infrastructure. That's our perspective.
And do you think the flood insurance program requirement that you build back in place needs adjustment, where properties are predictably going to be flooded over and over and over again in order to protect the integrity of the federal flood insurance program?
I think that we need to allow for a lot of flexibility in terms of where we reinvest and how we reinvest. We need to ensure that we're building for future conditions in terms of the design approach, but there will be areas where it'll become increasingly evident that it would be beneficial to not replace infrastructure in the same area and maybe utilize that land for storage and buffer to storm surge and alternatives to allow densification in other areas that may not be as exposed.
Yeah, agreed. My time has now expired, and you've all had a long morning, so let me follow Chairman Carper's lead and close out the hearing. The housekeeping rule before we adjourn is that senators must submit questions for the record by close of business Wednesday, November 15th, and we will compile those questions and send them to the witnesses, and we urge that you reply by Wednesday, December 6th. It's a pain in the neck to have to chase you, so we hope we can get, if there are questions for the record, timely and punctual responses. I thank you all for your presence here, and with that, the hearing is adjourned.